all-time boxing great Sugar Ray Leonard was on the Mike Tyson podcast called Hotboxing. So Tyson's got a social media YouTube platform called Hotboxing where he interviews loads of guests from Snoop Dogg to Jim Gray to Michael Buffer to you name it, not LL Cool J, so on and so forth. So he brings on Sugar Ray Leonard, and you have to understand that when Leonard was boxing in his prime, Mike Tyson was like 11, 12. So Tyson was 11, 12, looking up to Ray Leonard, who was just lighting the world up. And in terms of like boxing superstars, roughly it's Muhammad Ali, superstar in boxing, who transcended boxing. Then Sugar Ray Leonard at a lower weight division, not as big, but very, very big, and the biggest star since Ali. Then Mike Tyson, then Floyd Mayweather. There's no one else. There's other stars that have come along, but they weren't international stars that are outside of boxing as well as in boxing, if that makes sense. So anyhow, Leonard talks about when he was younger as an amateur, being abused by a coach and how he couldn't discuss that when he was boxing because his male pride as a champion, as a warrior, it wouldn't allow it. But now he's older, he's a lot more comfortable in talking about things that happened to him so he can reach and connect to other people. And he then says, I love you, Mike. So from my perspective, when I was younger growing up, all of the Mike Tyson fights on HBO, Sugar Ray Leonard was a ring analyst announcing the fight. So he saw Mike on the come up when he was sort of like, when Leonard's career was over. So Mike Tyson responds and he says, actually, Ray, I love you. You don't know what you did to me. And Mike goes on to talk about him being in a juvenile system. So basically in a young person's prison. It's called Spofford. It's like a secure unit for young children who are very vulnerable and are out committing crimes. Him being 12 years old and watching Ray Leonard fight Wilfred Benitez. And he says, when I seen that fight, he said, you inspired me so much. But when he said it, Mike is sweating and he's crying and he's in a very like, got like a very controlled voice because he knows he can't get too emotional because he'll start breaking out even more and he won't be able to speak. He says, you inspired me. I love you, man. Now, what you got to understand there is that when Tyson got into boxing around age 13, he met his mentor, Customatu, who schooled him on boxing. And before he did any sort of punching in the ring or any sort of like amateur fights, Cus made Mike understand the psychology of boxing, which was things like the champion and the coward, and how the coward feels the same way as the champ, how the champion feels the same way as the coward, but the difference is the champion, he goes forth and completes his outcome, while the coward runs away, and fear and fire, and how, you know, fire can sort of like can burn your house down, but it can heat your food. He gave him that kind of psychology. Alongside, he made Mike study the history of boxing. So Mike Tyson is a walking encyclopedia, and he can tell you anything about old fighters like Thomas Molyneux, Jack Dempsey, Jack Johnson, Sugar Ray Robinson, and he can tell you exact things that happened in certain rounds of the fight, and he can even give you like words they said after the fight. So when Cus was alive and Mike was young, Cus would be talking to like groups of friends who would come to the house and he'd talk about a fight, and then he'd say, Mike, what happened here? Because Cus couldn't remember because he was old. And Mike would say, oh yeah, this fighter said A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Do you know what I mean? That's how geeky Mike was, even though he was a young ghetto terror. So Mike is crying to Sugar Ray Leonard saying, you know, to me, you're immortal, you're a boxing god. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have this SHIT right here. And he's referring to, he's got his Tyson Ranch, his marijuana platform. He's now, you know, successful again, doing well in life, so on and so forth, whatever. And then Tyson says, you know, when you was fighting Roberto Duran, so Sugar Ray Leonard's first fight against Roberto Duran, he lost the fight 15 rounds, I think it was a split decision, but it was a back and forth fight, really close. And he was saying, Duran was getting all up in your ASS, but you was fighting back. Do you know what I mean? And also when he was talking about Wilfred Benitez, he was saying that Wilfred Benitez was an experienced champion. No one thought you had a chance in fighting him because you was an up and come back then, but you was just so confident and you beat him. Do you know what I mean? And then Mike went on to say, he said to Eben, who also presents for the Hot Boxing show, he says, Eben, do you not understand that, you know, when someone has that hands to you, when they can throw 3 punches and it sounds like one punch, like that is the art of fighting. And as he's saying that, he's crying, saying, this ain't funny, this ain't no joke. Like, I love the art of war. I've studied the art of war, and that's why I am who I am. And then Tyson goes on to say, he says, you know, I understand the art of war. I studied it, and I was the annihilator. And he said, but I'm not that person no more. But I miss him. I miss that person, and I feel like a punk. And then Mike goes on to say, but I'm scared of him. So it sounds to me like Mike Tyson's at a place in his life where he realizes that, that he was so passionate about boxing that he could have this sort of like this kind of maniac mentality in the ring, and it worked for him. But for him to succeed later on in life and be the husband and the father and to run his business, whatever, he has to let that go. And as he says now, I feel like a punk at times. He's conflicted, but he understands in order for him to be successful in life, he has to let the young man, the young man energy that has to get put to the side and say, right, I got to step back and be that wise character now. They talk about other stuff. They talk about the fight with Marvin Hagler, and Leonard says it was a hard fight, and it was close. But Tyson says, no, that wasn't a hard fight. You beat him easy. You made it look easy. So Leonard says, no, it was a hard fight. And Tyson says, well, okay. Well, if that's what you're saying, because you're being humble, but what did the scorecard say? So it was a good back and forth. They talk about the fight with Thomas Hearns. Talk about the fight with Donnie Lalonde. We also talk about being fathers and how, as rich people, how do they raise and discipline their children, which is quite interesting. But I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to post a link to that fight, to that interview here. As you know, this is MSLB, Mark Stoneland's Boxing. Please subscribe. Watch the link. Tell me what you think. It's over an hour long, so you can just watch it while you're in a bath or going for a jog. I've only given you a small 10% of what happened, maybe even like 5-6%. Yeah. Have a good day. Let me know what you think. Okay, bless.